The ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict has yet again brought into the spotlight the relevance and powers of the United Nations stated in the UN Charter. This as the UN marks its 78th anniversary today after it was established by the signing of the UN Charter in 1945 at the end of World War II. Its purposes included the maintenance of international peace and security, providing humanitarian aid, and the protection of human rights by its member states. Although the UN has grown to become the world's only universal global organization with many successes, including designing the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, it's also faced challenges, such as the composition of the Security Council's permanent members. But to talk more about the role and work of the UN, we are joined virtually by Nelson Muffuh, who is the United Nations Resident Coordinator in South Africa. Nelson, thank you. Thanks very, very much for your time.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on the program as we celebrate UN Day.
All right, so let's go a little bit back in time now. And as, you know, World War II was about to end in 1945, representatives of 50 different countries gathered at the United Nations Conference on International Organization to pave the way for the establishment of the United Nations. So if we look at the composition of the United Nations, how many member countries are there currently now as we speak?
From the 50 that gathered in 1945, joining the United States to make it 51 countries at the inception of the UN, that has grown over time to currently 193 countries since 2011, with South Africa being one of the founding members, being suspended for 20 years and rejoining in 1994 and being a relevant and global actor since then. So the UN really has grown over time, and its structures are being updated also and is being repositioned to be fit for purpose for the 21st century.
Yeah. But if we look at fit for purpose and we talk about the relevance of the United Nations, and I think it's important because many ask that questions, how is the UN relevant in the 21st century?
The UN remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. It is a project, a work in progress that really was set to help us achieve certain intangibles, but very necessary elements of our coexistence as humanity. World peace, human rights, and the pursuit for the well-being of people and planet, sustainable development, so to speak. So facing conflicts as we are in the world today, facing the scourge of inequalities and poverty, the UN remains relevant because it helps bring together the best of the world to be able to achieve all of these goals and aspirations that we have. The UN, just so I should clarify, comprises of its staff, comprises of member states, and comprises of non-state actors, all working together, collaborating to be able to achieve sometimes elusive goals.
Mm. If we look at a lot of and certainly elusive goals being one that we will focus a little bit beyond, because when we look at what's happening in the world today, one would ask the question, what is the UN really doing? And does it have any role in peacekeeping? Because it seems as though it's battling and struggling in a time like this where we are seeing more and more wars, fighting, humanitarian crises that are coming up all over the place, and yet people are looking to the UN and saying, what are you doing to prevent this? And we know that today, of course, marking the UN's anniversary, let's sort of look at that and say, you know, what do we celebrate for the UN when, in fact, at this point in time, the world's never been in a worse situation?
As the Secretary General of the United Nations just said on UN Day itself, he says, we are in a divided world and we must be a united nation. And it is really important that we look at what the UN is doing. The Secretary General, rest assured, and other leaders of the UN are very much seized on this matter. I've been traveling around the world, attending conferences, negotiating and trying to create the conditions for three things which the Secretary General recently called for over the weekend. Immediate humanitarian access, release of all hostages, and prevention of an escalation and a spillover and a return to the peace table. So this is something that world leaders are working on right now. The UN itself is seized of this matter. The UN General Assembly will be meeting on this tomorrow, or actually on Thursday this week. So with the question about how relevant the UN is, the UN remains, as I indicated, as relevant as ever. If there wasn't a United Nations, with the conflicts, the challenges that we're facing in the world today with regards to peace, with regards to climate change, with regards to poverty, the UN would be created to be able to help nations come together and try to solve the intangible problems that they're facing at the moment. Now, you ask about what the UN is doing on peace, for example. What the UN is doing is really to keep the flame of hope alive. The Secretary General is pushing significantly for what he's calling a surge in peace, but also to look at how we ensure that we don't even get into situations where we face conflict. So the root causes of conflicts is what we're working on. And the UN around the world, and certainly the UN in South Africa, is working to advance what we're calling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that really will help us really ensure that we are tackling the root causes of why people are poor, why we have inequalities, why we have conflicts amongst people, and distrust between people and each other and authorities.
So I want to, and nobody can dispute the good work that the UN does and how it assists people that are in desperate situations. But I think it's important also to focus on some of the issues that plague the UN and this particularly when it comes to the Security Council. And I want to focus on this just a little bit. For many that don't perhaps understand it, there are 5 permanent members that act on the Security Council, that we're talking about the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. And one has to know that if they veto anything that is brought about, they have the final word. So no matter how many votes are in favor of a resolution, if any of those nations veto it, it's out the window and it doesn't even move forward. So there was quite a very interesting point that was made by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's look at the issue on the UK. I want to read what he had to say about it. It was just a quote to take from him. To quote what he was saying, the United Nations can be simply closed. The UN system must be reformed immediately so that the veto is not the right to die, that there is a fair representation in the Security Council of all regions of the world, close quote. And this is a query from many people feeling that it is not representative of the world and that people are left to die purely because of the power in the hands of such few. What do you say about that?
I mean, I started off by saying the UN needs to be fit for purpose, updated to reflect the 21st century. The UN Secretary General and others are calling for a fundamental reform of the global governance architecture and global finance and trade architecture, including the Security Council. This is a matter that member states of the UN have been looking at for the last decade or so. There are intergovernmental negotiations unfolding, but what we're calling for, the Secretary General of the UN is saying the Security Council needs to be inclusive. It needs to be representative and reflective of the world we have today. Talking about Africa, for example, there is a call for increased permanent members states, a seat for African countries. And this is something that the Secretary General endorses and calls for, ensuring that there is a fundamental reform of the relevant global governance structures and to make it fit for purpose to deal with the challenges of today in an inclusive manner.
Yeah, it's something we feel like we've been speaking about for a very, very long time. I mean, when you look at that list, the omission of the likes of an African member is something that is glaringly obvious. And I mean, also with what's happening in the Gaza at the moment, you know, these wars will rage on until there's representation. And that's where the major criticism comes on. Do you think in our lifetime this will ever happen?
Certainly. We definitely are pushing hope, collaboration, and problem solving. And so there is no I think sense in doing the work we do if it's not about ensuring that we fundamentally believe that we can achieve some of the aspirations that we're pushing for, including ensuring that we're working governance architecture that reflects the world of today.
Yeah.
The UN, you started by asking how many member states it has. At inception, it had 51 member states. A number of African countries at that time were still under colonial rule, and only became progressively members of the United Nations from about 1960 until the last one joined in 2011, South Sudan. So the UN and the Security Council was established at a time when you did not have the number of African countries at the UN like you have today. So this is something that needs to be looked at, is being looked at, but member states have to come together and agree on this. And South Africa and the African Union are pushing quite forcefully for that. As you can see, for example, in the G20 recently, the African Union just got a seat at the table. So having said that, there are moves in the right direction, but Africa is not powerless at the UN as well. It's the largest bloc of member states in the General Assembly, and it uses its voice effectively when it needs to. And this is one of the times when Africa and others also have to step up and do that.
And it certainly is, but one would argue, if we look at the times again that we're living in, and I wish we had a longer time because I have to start wrapping, unfortunately. You know, the blood that's being shed in Gaza and at the moment, it seems that besides a few trucks trickling in to try and bring aid, the UN vetoing any resolution, stopping humanitarian assistance going in, calling for peace, these kind of things are just being left unabated. And one has to ask, you know, does this signify again that this organization is powerless?
Certainly not powerless, very relevant, and the charter upon which the UN was established remains I think our North Star, and we're pushing and working hard to ensure that there's durable peace, respect for human rights and international law, and certainly also looking at the war on poverty.
Yeah.
As the Secretary General has said, it is unacceptable that in a world of plenty, hunger and poverty has a hold. So we're working on all fronts in all areas of the world with all stakeholders and all countries, and certainly in South Africa as well, to ensure that we live in a world free from poverty, hunger, where everyone is empowered to play their part, where peace is not an elusive goal, but something we're all collectively working towards.
All right.
The
Nelson,
UN is a reflection of the world, but it doesn't have to remain that way.